If the daily mass goers will permit me to repeat this, but this last week we had the feast day of St. John the 23rd, who was Pope who opened the Second Vatican Council. And he was asked by a reporter one time, how many people work in the Vatican? And he responded back, about half of them. And was like, oh yeah. We need that sense of humor that a saint would have. And that reality is so much more important now when things around us seem to abound in injustices, lack of fidelity to truth. And we need God more than ever. We need to go near him in our prayer. We must speak to him in the intimacy of our hearts. And that reality must be first. So we need God because we need grace. And grace is really the presence of God in our soul. And human nature is wounded and wobbly without grace. It just is. And maybe, if people were to skip Mass or stop going to Mass or kind of coast along in their life, maybe they'll have a little money still in their pockets. Maybe they'll feel not so much different because they're eating chia seed and whatever else makes them feel healthy. But they will remain wobbly when the tests of faith come. And when the crisis moments come, they will crumble. And they'll go back to God, asking for his grace again. And God, being so merciful, he typically gives it, especially if the person is genuine, because he gives us so many chances to come to him and ask for his help. Today in the gospel, we actually are given this parable that's actually two parables. The first parable is the first 10 verses, where there's this search for wedding guests to come to this wedding feast for this king. And this invitation is much like the Mass. It really is. The wedding feast of the Lamb is our heavenly homeland, where we'll truly be at home, where there's going to be fullness of satisfied desire, eternal gladness, consummate delight, and perfect happiness. That is what we're meant for. And that's a foretaste right here in the Mass. We have a foretaste of heaven here, an invitation to joy. To think of Christianity as kind of gloomy and glum is to miss the point entirely, is to miss it completely. It is to joy that we are invited. It also reminds us that the things which make men and women deaf to the invitation are not necessarily bad in themselves. If we look at the parable, they left. They ignored the invitation. One went away to his farm. There's nothing wrong with farms. That's a good, wholesome way to grow up, in fact. And another to his business. There's nothing wrong with business either. Like the movers and shakers, they can help, help us support a community. We need that. We need good businesses, locally owned and operated typically, so there's not so much corporate reality. But these things, obviously, they're not immoral adventures to some Nevadan town or something. But they're a part of our life and they should be done well. But it's easy. It is so easy for all of us to become so busy with the things of time so that we forget or neglect the things of eternity, like our prayer life. And to be so preoccupied with the visible things that we forget about the invisible things. We're so easy to hear the things of the world so that one cannot hear the soft invitation of Jesus, the voice of Christ inviting us to come to him, especially when we're weary and find life burdensome. He tells us these things. He says, come to me. Don't go to some other self-help reality. A life lived focusing on second bests that tend to shut out the best. And the things that are good in themselves sometimes shut out the things that are supreme because we have a higher aim. And we would never become saints under the best conditions, but under the worst conditions. That's an interesting quote from St. Ignatius. We'd never become saints under the best conditions, but under the worst conditions, because then we aim higher. You look at the saints and they were surrounded by dysfunction, but they were like doctors in the midst. A man can be so busy making a living that he fails to make a real life, something that is filled with character. It's interesting too, since God should be the first one, and we should seek his grace, that strength within us, that interior strength, he is our priority. It's interesting about the word priority too. I'm a word nerd or whatever you want to say, but priority, 150 years ago, was always and everywhere in the singular. You look it up too. Look it up, the nature of the word. It was always used in the singular. And now we speak of priorities, right? But priority is supposed to be singular. There is one thing most necessary. I've never been by the bedside of somebody who is dying, and I've been at many of them. I've never heard anyone say things like, I regret not watching more TV. Like, I regret not, reading the paper more. There's nothing wrong with these things, right? But too much of them can drown out the most necessary things. It's much more like, I wish I would have spoke my mind a little bit more. Wish I would have spent more time with my family. Wish I would have gone to Mass more often. I wish I would have prayed more, because now that's all I want to do. It's amazing. And it's really a lot of wisdom that comes from people who are on their deathbeds or close thereafter in hospice care. It reminds us, too, that in the last word, God's invitation to us is an invitation to grace and to joy, to animate our life with a higher way of being. And it does mean a certain sense of denial and death, but not the death to our higher life, but to our lower lives. When our lower passions sometimes try to pull us down into those areas to really, drag us down in some ways and drown our love. And that is the fountain of youth, too, is love. Just to be sure, it's not in a makeup or in some diet. The fountain of youth is love. St. Jose Maria would often say, I feel so young. I'm always young. And they're like, why? Why do you feel that? And he said, because I'm in love. Those gathered in this parable from the highways and byways had no claim on the king at all, and perhaps didn't expect an invitation, nor did they feel they deserved it, but they got it. And they came to them from nothing other than the generosity of the king. And they were gathered in. And then the second parable comes, which is the king arriving, seeing all the guests, noticing the one without the wedding garment. Now, this is also a symbol for the soul. The wedding garment is a symbol for the soul, not only baptism, and we've got some baptisms today, actually. I'm really excited about that. And it's not just baptism, but it's also our soul. We need to hand back our soul to God in its original purity as much as we can possibly muster. And the man or woman who hands back their soul to God stained will stand condemned, because they will not have practiced the charity they were called to. This is why we need grace. I mean, human nature, like I said, is wobbly and wounded without grace. Jesus tells this parable and teaches us that the door to salvation is open to all. It really is. But of course, when they come, they must seek to live a life fit the love which has been given to them. They must seek to live a life that fits the love that has been given to them and offered them. Grace is indeed a gift, but it's also a responsibility. The man or woman cannot go on living the life they lived before they met Jesus Christ. They must be clothed with the new purity that comes from him, and a new holiness and a new goodness, a new calm, devoid of fears, of anxieties. The door will be open for the sinner, but not to remain a sinner, but to become a saint, to aim higher. The parable translates not to the clothes so much that we wear when we come to Mass, but the spirit in which we go to that Mass. I really encourage highly, too, when we come, to come a little bit early. And I know it's hard, especially our families, It's like, we just got here. We just barely got here, man. Like, Father, and I know that. If we can try just a little bit more each Sunday to come just a little bit more early, a little bit more, so that we can come to the pew, let our senses kind of settle a little bit, so that we can awaken that soul to the presence of God, who is there for our strength, to give us the love we need, that we crave, that we cannot seem to find around us throughout the rest of the week, because his is the only love that will never disappoint us. His is the only love, and it is beautiful. Too often we come without preparing for the Mass at all. And if we prepare to worship well, then after a little time in the pew of prayer, of a thought of our Lord's love, a little self-examination, then indeed it would be worship. It really would be a time to really give God worship. And then we would have results in our life. We really would. The cash value would come too. And we would be animated by the love of Christ. And that would transform our lives, the lives of our spouses, our children, our families, the life of the church, our nation, and also the affairs of the world would then be imbued with God's grace. But it begins at the local level. It begins in our own hearts, to listen to the voice of Christ, to seek his face, and to become his face for others. Let us put our hands out for grace. God is priority, and he will give us his grace if we are open and come with our souls ready to receive him.